What would you do if the world judged you before you even spoke? If the success you earned, the respect you built, and the calm you carried still weren't enough to be treated as equal? For Dr. Malcolm Pierce, that question became real at 30,000 feet when a flight crew decided that a black man in first class must have made a mistake. Within minutes, he was dragged from his seat, his dignity shattered in front of strangers with phones recording every second. But what they didn't know was who he really was. And when the truth came out, the same man they tried to humiliate would hold the power to decide the fate of the entire airline. So, ask yourself, if it were you, would you forgive or fight? Would you let the system break you? Or would you break the system that allowed it? This isn't just a story about race. It's about respect, power, and what justice truly means when the world is watching. Stay until the end, because one decision changed everything. If stories like this move you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. The air inside Aurora Air Flight 782 smelled faintly of roasted coffee and lemon sanitizer. The soft hum of the engines pulsed under the quiet chatter of passengers settling into their seats. At 7:45 a.m., the morning sun pushed through the glass windows of JFK Airport, scattering pale gold light across the first-class cabin. Dr. Malcolm Pierce placed his leather carry-on in the overhead compartment, careful not to disturb the woman already seated beside him. He was a tall, calm man in his late 40s, dressed simply a navy blazer, gray slacks, and wire-rimmed glasses that softened his intense gaze. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and warm. The woman nodded briefly, eyes glued to her phone. Malcolm sat down, adjusted his watch, and exhaled. It had been a long week. 3 cities, 4 speeches, endless questions about diversity and technology. He loved his work, but this morning, he wanted peace. Just a quiet flight to Seattle. Just a few hours to breathe. The flight attendant passed by, collecting jackets. "Can I get you anything before takeoff, sir?" she asked. Polite but distant. Her name tag read Lisa, and her smile seemed trained, mechanical. "Just water." "Thank you," Malcolm replied. Behind her, another attendant, Rick Halverson, stood at the galley door, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes followed Malcolm a little too long, just enough to feel like a stare. Malcolm noticed but didn't react. He'd learned long ago that reacting too quickly often confirmed people's worst assumptions. Rick leaned toward Lisa and whispered something. She didn't answer, just glanced nervously toward the first-class seats. Malcolm looked away. He took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness calm the sudden heaviness in his chest. The boarding continued. A man in a suit squeezed past, muttering about overbooking. A young mother bounced her baby, murmuring lullabies. The cabin smelled of cologne, fabric, and faint anxiety. Then came the voice, clear, sharp, cutting through the calm. "Sir, excuse me, this section is reserved." Malcolm looked up. Rick stood over him now, arms behind his back, posture crisp like a soldier's. "I'm sorry," Malcolm asked gently. "This is seat 2A, Rick said, tone clipped. "First class. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" A few heads turned. The woman beside Malcolm looked up from her phone, frowning slightly, not at Rick, but at the awkwardness now thick in the air. "Yes," Malcolm said after a beat. "That's my boarding pass." He handed it over, steady and polite. Rick took the paper, his jaw tightening as he scanned it. The silence stretched just a little too long. He muttered. "Sometimes people mix up the boarding zones. I travel often," Malcolm said, calm but firm. This is my seat? Rick's mouth twitched into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Right. Of course. Just double-checking. He handed the ticket back, but his tone dripped with skepticism. Then he walked off, leaving a faint trail of tension behind him. Malcolm looked out the window. Beyond the glass, a line of planes crawled across the tarmac. The sunlight reflected on his watch face, a retirement gift from his late mentor, engraved with 3 words, "Stand with grace." He whispered them now under his breath. Stand with grace. 10 minutes later, the announcement came: cabin crew, prepare for departure. Rick reappeared, striding down the aisle with a clipboard. He stopped again beside Malcolm's seat. Sir, could I see your ID? Please. Malcolm's brows furrowed. Is there a problem? It's just a security protocol, Rick said, though his tone carried a note of authority that wasn't quite regulation. Malcolm reached for his wallet, handed over his driver's license and boarding pass. Rick stared at the ID, then at Malcolm's face, as if comparing a counterfeit bill. Lisa, standing a few rows down, whispered, Rick, he's fine. Rick cut her off. Just doing my job. A middle-aged man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The atmosphere thinned. After a long pause, Rick returned the ID. All right, sir. You can stay seated. He turned sharply and disappeared toward the galley. Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment. His heartbeat was steady, but his hands felt cold. It wasn't the first time. Not the first look. Not the first question. But every time it scraped something raw inside him, he reached for his phone, opened a message from his daughter Maya's safe flight. Dad, don't forget to rest. He smiled faintly, typed back, always. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed. Outside, New York shrank into a mosaic of silver and shadow. Inside, whispers traveled like static. Rick's voice carried faintly from the front galley. I'm telling you, something's off. The system flagged him twice. Maybe it's a duplicate booking. Malcolm heard it. So did the woman beside him. She gave a small, embarrassed smile, as if apologizing for the rudeness she wasn't responsible for. When the engines roared for takeoff, Malcolm's stomach tightened, not from fear, but from restraint. He'd spent years teaching young executives about emotional intelligence, about staying composed under bias. But theory was easy when you weren't the one being judged. He folded his hands. Grace. He whispered again. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Rick returned with a tray. Would you like champagne or juice, he asked. His tone suddenly courteous, almost exaggerated. Malcolm knew that kind of politeness that came after someone realized they might have been wrong, but refused to admit it. Water's fine, he said. Rick nodded stiffly and moved on. A small act, but the air didn't clear. The tension lingered like invisible smoke. Across the aisle, Ellen Moore, a freelance journalist flying home from an assignment, noticed the exchange. Her instincts buzzed. She took out her phone, opened her camera, and quietly set it on her tray. Screen facing outward, just in case. For a brief while, peace returned. The cabin lights glowed soft amber. Malcolm opened a folder on his laptop draft notes for his next talk, Designing Technology Without Prejudice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He smiled wryly and kept typing. But the calm didn't last. A message tone beeped on Rick's handheld device. He read it, frowned, and turned back toward Malcolm. His steps were brisk, decisive. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me, he said quietly, but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Malcolm blinked, confused. Excuse me, "There's an issue with your booking. We need to verify it at the gate." "That's impossible," Malcolm said, voice still calm. "I've already boarded. Cleared TSA. Scanned twice." Rick's jaw clenched. "I don't want to cause a scene. Sir, please stand." And there it was, the phrase that always came before humiliation. Malcolm stared at him for a long second, then stood, every movement slow, deliberate. "Of course," he said softly. The cabin fell silent. The baby stopped crying. A phone camera clicked. Lisa looked torn. "Rick, please, we can. It's protocol." Rick snapped, "Let's go." As Malcolm stepped into the aisle, the woman beside him whispered, "I'm so sorry." He gave her a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. They began walking toward the front. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly. Every row another judgment, another whisper. "Unbelievable," someone muttered. "Maybe he snuck in." Another said, "No one stopped it." Ellen's phone kept recording. At the cabin door, Rick's grip tightened on Malcolm's arm, not violent, but firm, possessive. It was enough. The cameras caught that. Malcolm turned his head, eyes calm but unyielding. "You don't need to touch me," he said. Rick didn't respond. The captain's voice crackled faintly from the cockpit. "Rick, what's happening back there?" "Handling a situation." "Sir," Rick replied, pushing the door open. Outside, the bright morning flooded the jet bridge. For a moment, Malcolm's reflection appeared in the small window composed, silent, shadowed by authority he chose not to use. He stepped out without resistance. Behind him, a dozen phones followed his every move. "In the cabin," Ellen whispered. "They just dragged a black man out of first class, and he didn't even raise his voice." The live stream began, and in less than 20 minutes, the whole country would know his name. The rain in Seattle had a certain rhythm, a patient, steady whisper that filled the glass walls of EtherTech Tower with quiet music. 3 days before the flight, Dr. Malcolm Pierce stood before a crowd of young engineers in the company's atrium. The room shimmered with screens, bright minds, and the low hum of ambition. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. Technology. He began, his voice calm and deliberate. Can't be called innovation if it forgets the human it serves. A murmur rippled through the audience. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Every algorithm, every code you write it learns from us. And if we're not careful, it also learns our biases. It remembers who we overlook." He paused, eyes sweeping the faces before him. Different shades, accents, dreams. "Your brilliance is not what makes you powerful. Your empathy is—" Applause broke the stillness. A few interns whispered his name, their admiration genuine. Malcolm nodded politely and stepped away from the podium, letting his assistant handle the rest. He didn't like applause. It reminded him of a world that often clapped for progress while ignoring the people it left behind. Back in his office, the city stretched beyond the window-gray clouds, coffee shops, cranes building another skyline. He loosened his tie, exhaled, and looked at the framed photo on his desk. Maya, his daughter, graduation cap tilted, her mother's smile lighting her face. He missed her. Law school in Boston kept her busy, but they spoke every Sunday, no matter the time zones. She always asked, "Dad, do people treat you better now that you're a CEO?" He'd always answer, "They treat the title better, not the man." That night, after everyone had gone home, he sat alone under the soft glow of the city. Reports flickered on his screen, complaints filed against Aurora Air, an airline he'd quietly invested in years ago when it promised to champion inclusive skies. The irony wasn't lost on him now. One report caught his eye: multiple allegations of passenger profiling, cabin crew bias, flagging systems misidentifying ethnic passengers as potential risks. He rubbed his temple. "Same disease," he murmured, "just a different mask." He drafted a note to the FAA board, his other hat. As a safety advisor, he'd been pushing for deeper cultural audits in airline operations. Still, he knew how bureaucracy worked: painfully slow, conveniently blind. He saved the file, locked his screen, and looked out at the rain. "Maybe it's time they see what it feels like up close," he whispered, not realizing how prophetic the thought would become. The next morning, Maya called. Her voice, crisp and full of light, filled the kitchen as Malcolm made coffee. "You still flying today?" "Yeah," he said, stirring cream into his cup. "Aurora Air, straight to Seattle. I'll be home by evening." "You've been on the road for 2 weeks," she scolded. "Promise you'll rest this weekend. No meetings, no lectures." He chuckled. "I promise." A pause. Then softer: "Dad, do you ever get tired of having to prove you belong?" The spoon in his cup stopped moving. He glanced at the window, raindrops trailing like questions. "Yes," he said quietly. "But belonging isn't something they give you, Maya. It's something you decide not to surrender." Her voice trembled slightly. "Sometimes I wish you didn't have to fight so gracefully." He smiled. "Grace is the only armor that doesn't rust." They hung up after a few more minutes of small talk. Yet her words lingered like perfume, gentle but haunting. At JFK that morning, the terminal buzzed with its usual symphony: rolling suitcases, clinking coffee cups, muffled announcements. Malcolm moved through the crowd with unhurried confidence. He'd done this routine for years: check-in, security, gate. When the agent scanned his boarding pass, the machine beeped twice instead of once. She frowned. "Strange. The system's showing 2 bookings for this seat." "2?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'm the one standing here." She smiled awkwardly. "It's probably a glitch. Happens sometimes." He thought nothing of it. Just data noise, he told himself. But somewhere deep inside, a familiar unease stirred, the kind that whispers, "You've seen this pattern before." At the gate, a few passengers glanced at him, then looked away quickly. He'd felt that look his entire life: the flicker of assumption, the question behind polite smiles. "How did you get here?" He smiled to himself. "Through the same door as everyone else." When he finally boarded, the air smelled of new leather and recirculated confidence. He nodded at the crew, polite as always. "Morning." Rick Halverson barely nodded back. Malcolm took his seat and opened his notebook. He scribbled a line: "The higher you climb, the quieter the prejudice becomes, but it never disappears." He closed the book, unaware that the page he'd just written would one day be quoted across headlines. The day before his flight, something else had happened. A call from Robert Glenn, the chairman of Aurora Air. "Malcolm." Glenn's voice had been genial, but wary. "We've heard rumors you're looking into us." "Some sort of internal review. I review everyone," Malcolm replied evenly, "including myself." Glenn chuckled nervously. "Well, let's make sure no one misunderstands intentions. You know how sensitive these things can be." Malcolm had smiled then, though his eyes didn't. Sensitivity isn't the problem. Robert, blindness is. He ended the call and sat still for a long time, the city lights winking like small lies outside his window. He thought of his late wife, Angela, who used to say, People only fear truth when they've built comfort on its opposite. He missed her calm honesty, the way she could turn a sentence into shelter. He whispered now, to no one in particular, "I wish you could see what it's turning into. Angie, the world's spinning faster than its conscience." The rain outside thickened. That night, as he packed, he slipped 2 items into his briefcase, a small notebook filled with handwritten reflections from years of travel, and a sealed envelope labeled FAA Ethics Committee pending review. He planned to deliver it quietly after his flight, a report exposing discriminatory algorithms in airline booking systems. Evidence he'd been gathering for months. He never imagined he'd become part of the evidence himself. At the airport lounge, he sat near the window, sipping black coffee, while planes lifted into gray skies. The TV above played a news segment about corporate accountability. The anchor's voice echoed faintly. Recent reports suggest systemic bias remains deeply rooted in major industries, including aviation. He smiled faintly. "You have no idea," he murmured. A man seated nearby glanced at him and frowned slightly, as if surprised that someone like him, black, reserved, alone, was sitting in the elite members section. Malcolm caught the look, met it with quiet eyes, then turned back to his coffee. Years ago, such moments would sting. Now, they simply confirmed why his work mattered. His phone buzzed. A message from Maya Safe Skies. "Dad, love you." He typed back one word, "always." When the boarding call came, Malcolm gathered his things and walked toward Gate 32B. Outside, the rain had eased. The air smelled like steel and jet fuel. A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed at the window. "Look, Mom, another big plane." Malcolm smiled. "That's the sound of possibility," he whispered as he passed. He didn't see Rick Halverson at the gate counter, scowling at his monitor as a red alert blinked on the screen. "Duplicate passenger flag, seat 2A, Rick muttered. "Here we go again." As Malcolm stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the engines grew louder, the temperature cooler. He loved this moment, the threshold between earth and sky, where everything was possible and nothing was certain. He thought about his upcoming speech in Seattle, about Maya's laugh, about the line he'd written in his notebook. Then he thought of the world waiting beyond the clouds, still learning how to treat people like people. "Stand with grace," he whispered again, touching the engraving on his watch. He found his seat, placed his briefcase gently beneath the chair, and leaned back. Somewhere in the galley behind him, Rick was already typing a message to the flight deck. By the time the cabin doors closed, the storm had begun not outside, but in the quiet tension of human hearts about to collide. And Malcolm Pierce, calm as a lake before the wind, had no idea he was about to become the center of it. The plane had been in the air for less than 40 minutes when the unease began to build again, subtle as a draft through a closed door. At first, it was nothing more than glances, those quiet, assessing looks that lingered half a second too long. "Doctor." Malcolm Pierce had learned to read them. They always carried the same message: "You don't look like you belong here." He ignored it. The hum of the engine steadied him. He focused on the soft blue light stretching across the cabin ceiling, the faint smell of brewed coffee, the rhythm of pages turning as the businessman beside him flipped through a financial magazine. He told himself that maybe this flight would still be uneventful. A young attendant appeared, smiling mechanically as she moved from seat to seat with a silver tray. "Breakfast options, mushroom omelet or fruit platter," she said, polite but hurried. When she reached Malcolm, her tone faltered just slightly. "Sir." I believe your meal isn't listed. He looked up. That can't be right. I pre-ordered online. She checked her tablet, tapping the screen. It says meal not applicable. Perhaps it was an upgrade issue. Malcolm gave a calm smile. No worries. Just water then. Before she could answer, Rick Halverson appeared from behind the curtain like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. What's the issue here? The attendant hesitated. Minor glitch. Rick, I'll handle it. He took the tablet from her hand. His jaw tightened. Seat 2A, he said, eyes landing on Malcolm. This is the one flagged earlier. Flagged. The word dropped heavy, almost metallic. I thought we resolved that, Malcolm said quietly. Rick gave a small laugh that wasn't really a laugh. Sometimes systems don't forget as easily as people want them to. The passengers nearby were now pretending not to listen while clearly listening. The air grew still, the kind of stillness that happens before something breaks. Malcolm's voice was level. I'd appreciate if we didn't make a scene, Mr. Halverson. Rick leaned closer, just enough for the rows ahead to hear the whisper. Then don't give me a reason to make one. For a brief moment, Malcolm saw what lay behind the uniform and the thin smile, a man who believed his small authority was armor, who mistook control for dignity. The young attendant shifted awkwardly, murmured, I'll find another meal for him, and disappeared down the aisle. Malcolm turned back to his window. Clouds drifted like continents below. He exhaled slowly. In his mind, he pictured Maya's voice telling him to stay calm, to remember who he was. Stand with grace, he reminded himself. But grace, in moments like these, felt heavier than any weight the sky could hold. Half an hour later, when coffee service began, Rick walked past Malcolm's seat and skipped him entirely. The man behind him raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, the passenger said. I think you missed someone. Rick didn't turn around. We're out of dark roast. Malcolm said nothing. He folded his hands, staring at the reflection in the plastic cup holder. The distorted image of his face looked tired, older than it was. Ellen Moore, sitting 2 rows back, caught the exchange. She wasn't filming yet, but her journalist instinct stirred. There was a tension in the cabin that didn't belong on an ordinary flight. She leaned to the side, whispered to the woman next to her. You feel that the woman frowned. The way he's treating that man? Yeah, it's hard to miss. Ellen nodded. It's building. You can always tell before it blows up. She opened the Notes app on her phone and typed a single-line bias at 30,000 feet. Document everything. Meanwhile, Rick was pacing the aisle again. Each time he passed Malcolm, his gaze lingered a little too long. Once, when Malcolm met his eyes, Rick muttered under his breath, People like you always find a way to play the victim. Malcolm's grip tightened around his seatbelt buckle. He wanted to respond. He wanted to tell this man who he really was, not to boast, but to remind him that authority built on disrespect was already collapsing. But he didn't. He simply said, Kindness costs nothing. You might try it. Rick froze for half a second, then walked away. The businessman beside Malcolm cleared his throat and said quietly, For what it's worth, sir. That wasn't right. Malcolm gave a brief nod. Thank you. The rest of the flight seemed to stretch endlessly, the hours thick with invisible tension. Every sound felt amplified: the click of heels, the hiss of the espresso machine, the muffled coughs from the back. Even the clouds outside looked sharp-edged. Then came the announcement, Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be experiencing slight turbulence for the next few minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts. The plane trembled softly. Malcolm's briefcase shifted under his seat, and a folder slid halfway out. A corner of a document peeked from it, bearing the FAA logo. Rick, walking past, noticed. His eyes narrowed. "What's that?" Malcolm calmly pushed the folder back in place. "Work material." "You're not allowed to have unsecured items during turbulence," Rick said sharply. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "It's secure now." Rick stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think being clever makes you special?" Malcolm met his stare evenly. "No, but being decent does." For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Rick turned abruptly and walked off, muttering something into his headset. Ellen saw the tension in their body language, the rigid posture of a man ready to misuse his small slice of power. Her thumb hovered over her phone's record button. She didn't press it yet. She glanced out the window. The sun had begun to pierce through the clouds, casting slivers of gold across the cabin. But the air inside felt colder. Lisa, the kind attendant from earlier, returned quietly to Malcolm's seat. She placed a cup of hot tea on his tray. "For you, sir," she whispered. He looked up. "Thank you." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm sorry about all this. Some people forget what service means." Malcolm gave her a gentle smile. "Don't be sorry for someone else's blindness." When she walked away, Ellen noticed the kindness in his tone, the restraint, the way he refused to meet hate with heat. It stirred something in her. She'd covered protests, trials, politics, but what she saw now was something rarer. Quiet resistance. By the time the seatbelt sign went off, Rick was back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth, "we'll be arriving in Seattle in approximately 3 hours. Please remain seated as we verify passenger documentation for routine security." Malcolm's eyes lifted. Documentation? He knew that wasn't standard procedure. Rick walked straight toward him, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Pierce, right. We'll need to recheck your ticket and ID." "Again!" The whispers began. The couple across the aisle exchanged looks. The woman muttered, "Why him?" Malcolm handed over his ID, voice quiet. "You've already checked it twice." Rick's smile was tight. "Let's make it 3. Third time's the charm." Lisa approached, concern written all over her face. "Rick, there's no directive for that." "New policy," Rick said curtly. Malcolm leaned back, letting silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. Then he said softly, "Policies built on prejudice are just excuses wearing uniforms." Rick flushed, his hand gripping the clipboard. For a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But then he forced a grin and said, "Enjoy the flight, sir." As he turned away, Ellen finally pressed record. Her camera caught the edge of his smirk, the hush of the cabin, the look on Malcolm's face composed, patient, unbroken. The footage would later become the first frame of a viral video. Malcolm didn't know it yet. He only felt the quiet ache behind his ribs, the same one that came every time the world reminded him he was tolerated, not accepted. He closed his eyes and whispered, barely audible, "Grace, always Grace," from her seat. Ellen watched him, her mind already writing the headline she didn't yet know she'd publish a lesson in dignity. 30,000 feet above the ground. The engines hummed on. The sky outside looked endless. But somewhere inside the cabin, the first storm had already begun to form. The cabin had gone quiet again, the kind of silence that wasn't peace but waiting. The sky outside had turned a deeper blue, sunlight stretching in long, thin ribbons through the windows. Malcolm Pierce had begun to think the tension might finally settle when Rick's voice came back over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone tight, "we're experiencing a verification issue with one of our passengers. Please remain seated as we coordinate with ground security." The words rippled through the cabin like electricity. Whispers broke out almost instantly. Verification issue. "What does that mean?" someone asked. "Did they find something?" Malcolm sat perfectly still. He knew that tone professional on the surface, sharp with accusation underneath. He could feel eyes sliding toward him, curious, cautious, assuming. His hands rested on his knees, fingers unclenched, knuckles white only from the effort of restraint. Lisa, the young attendant, appeared at his side, her face pale. "Sir," she whispered, "I'm so sorry about this. He's called for ground intervention when we land. I'm trying to fix it, but he won't listen." Malcolm looked up at her, his eyes calm. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Just keep doing what's right. A few rows back." Ellen Moore watched as Rick stalked down the aisle with the deliberate gait of someone who believed the whole plane was his courtroom. He stopped at Malcolm's seat again. "Mr. Pierce," Rick said, his voice echoing just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You've ignored a direct instruction. I asked you to stay off electronic devices, and you continued using your laptop." Malcolm blinked. "That's not true," he replied evenly. "My laptop's closed. It has been." Rick smirked. "You think I didn't see you typing? We have procedures for a reason." Malcolm's voice remained low. "Those procedures don't include public humiliation." Rick's smile thinned. "I'm not humiliating anyone. Sir, I'm maintaining order. Now, I'll ask one last time. Please come with me to the front cabin while we verify your credentials." The businessman sitting across the aisle muttered, "He's already shown his ID." Rick shot him a glare. "Sir, please refrain from interfering." Malcolm rose slowly, the way a man does when he knows every gesture will be scrutinized, every breath misread. His height drew attention, strong shoulders, a quiet composure that made the scene even more absurd. "I have nothing to hide," he said. As he stood, Rick's hand darted out and gripped his forearm, not violently, but with that same unnecessary assertion of control. The moment his fingers touched Malcolm's sleeve, the woman in the next row gasped. Someone's phone camera clicked, then another. "Sir," Malcolm said softly, looking down at Rick's hand. "Let go." Rick's face flushed. "You're being uncooperative." Lisa stepped forward. "Rick, stop it. He's not resistant." "Step back, Lisa," Rick snapped, his tone rising. "You're out of line." The cabin erupted in murmurs now. "This is ridiculous," one man said. "He's just sitting in first class." Another passenger added, "I saw him board. He had a ticket." Rick's voice climbed louder. "Security will handle this if you won't." And then it happened, the single, irreversible moment that would ignite everything. Rick tugged Malcolm forward. It wasn't a violent yank, but the cabin was small, and the movement looked worse than it was. The cameras caught it, a uniformed attendant dragging a black man out of his seat in first class. Malcolm didn't resist. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but clear. "You don't have to do this," Rick barked. "Then cooperate." "I am cooperating." The sound of his calm only made the scene more powerful. The quieter he became, the louder the injustice sounded. Ellen was already live streaming. Her voice trembled as she whispered into her phone. "They're dragging a passenger out of first class for no reason. He's calm. He's not resisting. This is wrong." Malcolm's bag slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. The corner of the FAA folder peeked out again, the seal glinting under the light. Someone zoomed in with their camera. Rick saw it too. His expression faltered. "What's that?" he demanded. Malcolm looked at him, eyes steady. "Something you'll wish you hadn't touched." But Rick was already pulling him toward the front. The aisle felt narrower than ever. Faces blurring together, shock, anger, disbelief. The tension of decades replayed in a single scene at 30,000 feet. Lisa's voice cracked behind them. "Rick, please, you're making a mistake." He didn't answer. He marched ahead, dragging the moment with him like a storm cloud. As they reached the galley, the intercom buzzed. Captain Dean Walsh's voice filled the cabin. "Rick, what's going on back there?" Rick pressed the button. "Passenger non-compliance. I'm escorting him to verify identity. Static." Then the captain's voice again, cautious. "That's not standard. We'll handle it after landing." Rick hissed into the mic. "With respect, sir. It's already handled." Ellen's camera caught the entire exchange. The view showed Malcolm standing calmly by the door, hands visible, posture composed. Rick's face was red, breath short, frustration dripping from every motion. "Sir," Malcolm said softly, "you've crossed a line." Rick laughed, brittle and forced. "You people always think there's a line." The cabin gasped collectively. Even he realized too late what he'd said. Ellen's voice, still narrating quietly for her live stream, broke slightly. He said it. He actually said it. For the first time. Malcolm looked angry, not wild, not loud, but deeply human. "Say that again," he said. Rick's lips parted, then closed. Silence stretched, suffocating. The engines hummed, indifferent. Finally, Malcolm stepped aside. "You know what? Go ahead. Finish what you started." He turned toward the jet bridge door. Lisa reached out, but he shook his head gently. "Don't. This isn't your burden." Two security officers were already waiting outside the door at the next gate connection in Denver, summoned by Rick midair. As soon as the door opened, they stepped in, confused but compliant, following the report they'd been given. "Is there a problem here?" one asked. Rick straightened. "Yes. Passengers refusing identification." Malcolm opened his wallet, handed his ID without a word. The officer glanced down, read it, and froze. His eyes flicked up in disbelief. "Sir," he said slowly, "this says you're Malcolm Interrupted," his voice calm but carrying weight. "Yes, Dr. Malcolm Pierce, FAA Safety Division, Regional Director." The cabin behind him went silent. The phone stopped moving for a beat. Ellen's camera caught the stillness the way power shifted in an instant. Invisible, but absolute. Rick's face drained of color. You didn't say," Malcolm turned to him, his tone like steel under velvet. "You never asked." He took his briefcase from the floor, straightened his jacket, and looked toward the stunned officer. "Am I free to return to my seat?" The officer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Of course." But Malcolm didn't move. He looked around the cabin one last time. The passengers stared back, some guilty, some furious, all silent. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Silence is also a choice." Then he stepped off the plane. Ellen followed him with her camera through the jet bridge, whispering, "That's him. The man they dragged. He's not just anyone. He works for the FOO." Her voice trembled with realization. They picked the wrong man this time. Within minutes, the live stream had over 200,000 views. By the time the plane touched down, Aurora Air was trending worldwide, and somewhere inside an office in Seattle. Robert Glenn stared at his phone, pale as ash, realizing his airline had just made history for all the wrong reasons. The terminal buzzed with the sound of confusion, whispers chasing one another like static electricity. Passengers from Flight 882 spilled out into Gate C-17, some clutching phones, some just staring. A few had tears in their eyes, not from fear, but from disbelief. They had just witnessed something that would replay in their minds for years. Dr. Malcolm Pierce stood near the glass wall overlooking the tarmac. Beyond it, the jet he had been dragged from sat motionless under the pale Seattle sun, its logo glinting Aurora Air, proud and modern, now trembling beneath the weight of its own arrogance. A security officer approached him again, now speaking with deference. Dr. Pierce, we've been informed that Aurora Air's corporate office is requesting a private conversation to apologize personally. Would you be open to that? Malcolm's expression didn't shift. His voice was even. They should apologize to every person who's ever been treated the way I was, not just to me. Ellen Moore, still holding her phone, took a careful step forward. Her live stream was still rolling, thousands of comments flooding in by the second. Dr. Pierce, she said softly, people are watching this everywhere right now. Would you like to say something? He hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood the power of silence. Then he looked directly into her camera lens. In this country, he began quietly, we tell ourselves that dignity is something everyone is entitled to. But too often, it depends on the color of your skin, the seat you're in, or who's watching. He paused, the faint hum of planes filling the space between words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break a rule. I was dragged because someone's prejudice spoke louder than my presence. The terminal fell still. Even the officers standing nearby seemed to stop breathing. Malcolm continued, what happened today isn't just about me. It's about the man in row 24 who's been asked to prove he belongs. It's about the woman told she's too loud, too confident, too much of herself to be respected. It's about the quiet cruelty we pretend not to see. Ellen lowered her phone slowly, her throat tight. The comments were exploding. This man speaks truth. Fire that crew. Systemic racism on full display. Just then, another voice cut through the noise. A deep, urgent voice that carried authority. Dr. Pierce. A tall man in a navy suit was striding toward them. Robert Glenn, CEO of Aurora Air. His tie was crooked, his face pale, but his tone tried to stay composed. Dr. Pierce, I came as soon as I saw the footage. This should never have happened. You have my sincerest apology. Malcolm turned slowly. Do I? He asked quietly. Or do you have a crisis to manage? The air around them seemed to thin. Glenn swallowed hard. Both, he admitted. But that doesn't change the fact that what happened was unacceptable. The crew involved will be placed on immediate suspension, pending investigation. We're reviewing procedures. Malcolm raised a hand, stopping him. Procedures aren't the problem. Culture is. For a second, Glenn looked lost. We're willing to make this right, he said. However you see fit. Malcolm's tone softened, but his gaze didn't. I don't want compensation. I want accountability, not a press release, not a promise. Change. Ellen's camera captured the exchange, the way Malcolm's calm presence dwarfed the CEO's power. The moment was already spreading across every platform. Boss dragged from first class. My Aurora accountability. About Malcolm Pierce. Across social media, the clip of Rick Halverson dragging Malcolm was looping endlessly. Millions were watching. Thousands were calling for justice. Airlines were issuing statements. Politicians tweeting. Journalists debating. It was no longer a story. It was a movement. Lisa appeared suddenly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Dr. Pierce, she said softly, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop him. Malcolm gave her a small nod. I know you did. Glenn glanced at her, confused. And you are Lisa, cabin crew, Flight 882. He hesitated, then extended a hand. You'll be hearing from me soon. Lisa, you did the right thing. She didn't shake his hand. Instead, she looked at Malcolm. If you ever need a witness, I'll testify. He humiliated you in front of everyone. Malcolm gave her a quiet smile. The truth doesn't need permission to stand. Moments later, Glenn's assistant hurried over, whispering something in his ear. His face paled further. We just received notice. The FAA has requested an immediate emergency review of Aurora Air's operational license. All eyes turned toward Malcolm. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of resolve behind it. I didn't request that, he said, but it doesn't surprise me. Glenn's voice trembled. Do you have influence there? Malcolm looked directly at him. I'm not here as an official. I'm here as a man who's tired of being treated as less than one. Ellen whispered to her camera. He's not just a passenger, he's a regulator. The FAA might actually shut them down. By that evening, news networks had already picked up the story. The footage played on every screen, the dragging, the confrontation, the reveal. Anchors spoke in somber tones. Analysts debated policy. Outside Aurora Air headquarters in Seattle, protesters gathered with signs, "Respect takes off here," "Accountability at 30,000 feet," "Justice for Pierce." Malcolm didn't return home that night. He stayed in a quiet downtown hotel, overlooking the Sound. The city lights shimmered on the water like small promises. He sat by the window, watching the reflection of himself, a man both weary and resolute. His phone buzzed. It was Maya, his daughter. Dad, I saw the news, she said, her voice breaking. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. They dragged you. Dad, her voice trembled. You always tell me to stay calm, but how do you stay calm through that? He took a slow breath. Because if I lose control, they win twice. Once by disrespecting me, and once by defining me. She was silent for a moment, then said softly, I'm proud of you. Malcolm smiled faintly. That means more than anything they could offer me. After the call ended, he turned back to the window. His reflection looked steadier now, stronger. By morning, Aurora Air's board of directors held an emergency session. Stock had plummeted 15% overnight. Advertisers were pulling out. The FAA review had frozen all scheduled flights pending investigation. Glenn stood in the boardroom, surrounded by silence, the city skyline burning gold behind him. He replayed the video once more, unable to look away from the image of Rick pulling Malcolm down the aisle. One man, he muttered, brought down the whole company. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. It wasn't one man. It was years of unchecked arrogance, of dismissive smiles, of believing respect was optional. Later that day, Glenn held a press conference. Cameras flashed. The world watched. He began with a rehearsed apology, but halfway through, he stopped. The teleprompter's words looked hollow. He set the paper down. Aurora Air failed Dr. Pierce, he said, and in doing so, we failed every passenger who has ever trusted us to treat them with dignity. The clip went viral within minutes, but the true change didn't happen on camera. It began quietly. In the spaces between words, Malcolm received messages from thousands of strangers pilots, nurses, teachers, students. Some said they cried watching the footage. Others said they finally felt seen. And amid it all, Ellen published her article that evening. Its headline read, dragged from first class. He grounded an airline not with rage, but with grace. Her opening line captured what everyone felt, but couldn't quite put into words. He didn't fight back because he was weak. He stayed calm because he knew strength doesn't always shout. It stands. By dawn, the news had spread faster than any aircraft Aurora Air had ever flown. Screens in airports from New York to Los Angeles looped the same footage, Rick Halverson dragging Dr. Malcolm Pierce down the aisle, his calm face framed by chaos. The video played without commentary, because it didn't need any. The image spoke louder than words. At 7:15 a.m., Aurora Air grounded every flight in North America. Thousands of passengers sat stranded in terminals, staring at departure boards that flashed canceled in red. On social media, the hashtag Aurora Shutdown climbed to #1 worldwide. In a small hotel suite overlooking the bay, Malcolm woke to the sound of his phone vibrating relentlessly. He blinked against the morning light, answering without checking the caller ID. Dr. Pierce. The voice was tired, formal. This is Deputy Director Reynolds from the FAA. We're conducting an emergency compliance audit following yesterday's incident. We need your assessment. Malcolm's tone was measured. You're asking whether Aurora Air can continue to operate? Yes, sir. The footage raises questions about their internal culture and passenger safety practices. The public pressure is immense. He sighed softly. I know. We'll follow your recommendation, Reynolds added after a pause. Whatever you say carries weight. When the call ended, Malcolm sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the water rippling against the window. Below, a flock of seagulls traced slow circles above the pier. The irony wasn't lost on him, planes grounded, but birds still flying freely. A knock came at the door. It was Ellen Moore, holding a paper cup of coffee. Her eyes were tired but alert. I figured you'd need this, she said. He took it with a faint smile. Thanks. You've been up all night, haven't you? She nodded. The story's everywhere. You're on every screen. They're calling you the man who grounded the skies. He gave a quiet chuckle. That wasn't my goal. I know. But people needed to see this. The calm way you handled it, it's resonating. She hesitated. You could change the industry. Malcolm leaned against the window, watching the horizon. Change doesn't come from anger alone. It comes when people realize the cost of their indifference. Down below, television trucks were lining up in front of Aurora Air's headquarters. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who walked through the doors. The company's logo, a stylized sun over wings, had never looked more ironic. Inside that building, Robert Glenn faced the longest morning of his career. The boardroom was filled with anxious executives, their laptops open to live feeds of protests outside. Revenue losses already exceed $80 million. One executive said, We've got government inspectors on site, every contract under review, and 3 major investors pulling out. Glenn rubbed his temples. We can't operate under these conditions. If the FAA revokes our license, we're finished. Maybe we deserve to be, someone muttered from the end of the table. Glenn looked up sharply. What did you say? The voice belonged to Samantha Chen, the company's ethics officer, her calm expression hiding frustration. I said maybe we earned this. We built a culture where people like Rick felt untouchable. This wasn't one bad day. It was years of quiet neglect. Silence filled the room. Glenn exhaled slowly. Then maybe it's time we let someone else lead the way. Outside, the streets were swelling with protesters. Some held signs demanding justice for Dr. Pierce. Others held up banners with the words "Ground Prejudice, Not People." Malcolm watched the coverage from his hotel room, his expression unreadable. Ellen sat beside him, typing notes for her next article. "You're not saying much," she said gently. "Are you angry?" He shook his head. "Anger's easy. What I feel is heavier. I'm thinking about everyone on those plane's pilots, attendants, passengers caught in the middle of something they didn't create." She looked at him curiously. "Do you regret it?" He paused. "I regret that it had to happen this way, but I don't regret standing still when they wanted me to bow." His phone buzzed again. This time, the message came from Maya. "Dad, the kids at school watched your video in civics class. My teacher said you showed the country what dignity looks like." He smiled faintly. "Dignity isn't what we show. Sweetheart, it's what we keep when the world tries to take it." Later that afternoon, the FAA held a televised briefing. Deputy Director Reynolds stood at the podium. "Effective immediately," he announced, "Aurora Air's license is suspended pending a full investigation into discriminatory practices and passenger safety violations." The room erupted in questions. Reporters shouted over one another. Ellen watched the broadcast from the hotel lobby, whispering, "There it is. The shutdown's official." Across the room, Malcolm sat silently, hands clasped. For a man who had just seen the nation's seventh largest airline collapse, he looked neither triumphant nor relieved, only thoughtful. When the press conference ended, Ellen approached him again. "They'll rebuild," she said, "with you as the symbol." "I don't want to be a symbol," he replied softly. "Symbols fade. Systems endure." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe you should help build the new one." That evening, Glenn called. His voice sounded different, stripped of pride, heavy with fatigue. "Dr. Pierce," he began, "I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to ask. Can we talk?" Malcolm hesitated. "Why?" "Because I want to fix what we broke, and I don't know how without your help." There was sincerity in his tone, but also fear, the sound of a man realizing his empire had cracked because of something deeper than profit. Malcolm agreed to meet him. The next morning, they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room overlooking the grounded fleet. Rows of gleaming planes stretched endlessly on the tarmac, their wings useless in the sunlight. Glenn spoke first. "When I started this company, I told myself we were connecting people, but somewhere along the line, we started separating them instead." Malcolm studied him. Change begins with accountability, not just for one man, but for a culture that rewarded silence. Glenn nodded. "Then help me rebuild it. You have the credibility. The public trusts you." Malcolm leaned forward. "If I do this, it won't be cosmetic. We'll need mandatory equity training, transparent complaint channels, and leadership restructuring. Real change, not slogans." Glenn hesitated. "You'd oversee it if I commit." "I commit fully, but on one condition." Glenn looked up. "Anything." Malcolm's voice was quiet, deliberate. "You don't get to control the narrative. The people you hurt will—" For a long moment, Glenn said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed." A week later, Malcolm stood on the tarmac beside Glenn during the press conference, announcing the Aurora Renewal Initiative, a comprehensive reform plan that placed employee accountability, diversity oversight, and independent audits at its center. Ellen covered the event live. Her voice was steady, almost reverent. "It's not often that we see redemption written in real time, but today, the man once dragged from his seat stands beside the one who ordered the planes that carried him." When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium. The camera zoomed in, catching the quiet conviction in his eyes. "Justice isn't about grounding planes," he said. "It's about grounding values that should never have taken flight. We can't rewrite yesterday, but we can decide how tomorrow takes off." The crowd fell silent. For a brief second, even the wind seemed to pause. Somewhere in that stillness, amid flashing cameras and roaring headlines, Malcolm felt something rare, a quiet sense of balance. Not victory, not revenge, just peace. That night, as he returned to his hotel, Maya called again. "You did it?" "Dad," she said. He smiled, watching a plane take off in the distance, the first Aurora flight since the shutdown. Its engines roared into the dark sky, steady and bright. "No," he said gently. "We all did." The first morning Aurora air returned to the skies was oddly quiet. No triumphant music, no banners waving, just the low hum of engines and the heavy awareness that every eye in the nation was watching. The company had become more than an airline. It was now a test of whether redemption could truly fly. Dr. Malcolm Pierce arrived at the Aurora headquarters early that day. The building, once a symbol of corporate arrogance, had changed in subtle ways. The polished walls no longer gleamed with self-importance. Posters now lined the lobby, carrying phrases like "accountability takes courage" and "dignity is non-negotiable." It was a start, he thought, but slogans alone wouldn't carry this change. Robert Glenn was already waiting for him in the conference room. He looked 10 years older than when they first met. There was humility in his stance now, the kind that only comes after losing everything and realizing it was deserved. "Morning, Malcolm," he said, offering a handshake that felt less like a gesture of power and more like a truce. "Morning," Malcolm replied. "How's the staff responding to the new protocols?" Glenn sighed. "Mixed. Some are grateful. Some think it's just a PR stunt. And some are angry they have to change." "That's expected," Malcolm said. "You're not just fixing policies. You're reshaping culture. People fight what they don't understand." As they walked through the operations floor, Malcolm noticed something striking. The air felt different. The old hierarchy, the silent superiority that once lingered in glances and tones, had cracked. Employees greeted one another with cautious respect. Still, behind polite smiles, there were doubts, murmurs of, "Let's see how long this lasts." He paused at the crew training area. Through a glass panel, he watched Lisa, the attendant who had stood up for him, now leading a group discussion. Her voice carried calm authority. "This isn't about blame," she said. "It's about awareness. The moment we assume someone's worth by how they look or speak, we fail our job." Malcolm smiled faintly. She was a natural leader. Glenn followed his gaze. "She's been remarkable," he said quietly. "I'm promoting her to head of in-flight ethics." "She's earned it," Malcolm said simply. A few hours later, the board gathered for the first Aurora Renewal Council meeting. The atmosphere was charged not with hostility, but with tension, the kind that comes when people know the stakes are higher than ever. Samantha Chen, the ethics officer, began. "We've completed phase 1 of reform, mandatory empathy training, bias workshops, and the anonymous accountability system are live." One board member, an older man named Hugh Lawson, crossed his arms. "With all due respect, this is costing us millions. Are we running an airline or a social experiment?" Samantha's gaze was cool. "We're running a company that forgot people built its wings. If that's an experiment, maybe it's one worth funding." Glenn stayed silent, watching how Malcolm handled it. Malcolm leaned forward, his tone measured but unflinching. Hugh, I've spent most of my life studying what causes systems to fail. It's rarely a technical fault. It's almost always human arrogance. Aurora collapsed because arrogance took the pilot's seat. The room went quiet. Glenn nodded slowly. We either change because we choose to, or because the world forces us to again. And we might not survive a second fall. After the meeting, Malcolm stood by a large window overlooking the runways. A line of planes glistened under the midday light, each freshly painted with the new company motto beneath the logo, "Every seat has worth." Lisa approached, holding a small folder. "The first flight under the new training departs this afternoon," she said. "Would you like to board it?" He hesitated. "After what happened last time, I swore I'd never sit in one of those seats again." She smiled gently. "Maybe that's exactly why you should. Later that afternoon." Malcolm walked onto the jet bridge, heart steady but heavy. As he stepped through the cabin door, a quiet murmur spread among the passengers' recognition. Cameras rose discreetly, but he simply nodded and took his seat in 2A, the very same number as before. Lisa came by, now in a senior uniform, her posture strong. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Pierce," she said, with a warm smile. "It's an honor to have you flying with us." He looked up at her and said softly, "It's good to see what change looks like." During the flight, the atmosphere was surprisingly peaceful. No tension, no whispered judgments, just ordinary kindness. Passengers chatted, crew smiled, the plane glided smoothly over the clouds. It felt like a small miracle, one stitched together by accountability and humility. Midway through the flight, an older woman seated behind him leaned forward. "Excuse me, are you the man from the video?" He turned slightly, giving a small nod. "I just wanted to say," she said, her voice trembling, "my grandson's mixed race. He saw what happened to you and asked me if people like him will ever be safe in this world. I didn't know what to tell him, but now I think I can." Malcolm's throat tightened. "Tell him that safety isn't given," he said quietly. "It's built one act of courage at a time." When the plane landed in Chicago, applause erupted spontaneously. It wasn't for the landing, it was for what the flight represented. Ellen Moore was waiting at the gate, camera ready. "So," she said, smiling as Malcolm stepped out, "how did it feel being back in the sky?" He smiled faintly. It felt like forgiveness. Her eyes softened. "Do you think it'll last?" "That depends," he said. "Redemption is a flight that needs constant maintenance." As they walked toward the terminal exit, passengers stopped him to thank him, some with handshakes, some with hugs. One man, wearing an Aurora uniform, whispered, "I used to look the other way when things happened. Not anymore. You changed that." Malcolm nodded, moved but reserved. Then maybe all this wasn't in vain. That evening, as the sun set over the Chicago skyline, Malcolm sat by his hotel window again. The same posture as before, but this time his reflection didn't look weary. It looked peaceful. The phone rang. It was Glenn. "The first day's reports are in," he said. "0 complaints. Highest passenger satisfaction in our history." "That's good," Malcolm replied. "But keep watching the small things. Respect erodes quietly." "I will," Glenn said. Then, after a pause, "You were right. Procedures weren't the problem. People were, including me." Malcolm's voice softened. "Then start by forgiving yourself. Guilt doesn't rebuild, accountability does." When the call ended, Malcolm looked out at the distant airport lights blinking like scattered stars. Somewhere in the night sky, another Aurora jet took off, steady and bright, He whispered to himself, "Maybe now. The sky remembers." The next morning, headlines carried a single phrase that spread across news outlets like wildfire. Aurora Air takes off again, this time with humanity on board. And beneath it, Ellen's article closed with one line that captured the heart of it all. Justice grounded the planes. Grace helped them fly again. The first weeks after Aurora Air's relaunch felt like breathing after a storm, fresh but fragile. The planes flew, passengers smiled, and the media began to shift from outrage to cautious optimism. Yet beneath that thin layer of calm, something else was growing: resentment. The kind that didn't shout, but whispered in break rooms and private group chats. Dr. Malcolm Pierce sensed it the moment he returned to the headquarters. People greeted him politely, their words smooth, but their eyes told another story. He'd seen that look before: respect mixed with quiet blame. In their minds, he hadn't just exposed injustice. He had cost them comfort, jobs, and pride. In the hallway outside the operations office, he overheard two maintenance workers murmuring, "You can't say anything now." One muttered, "You look at someone the wrong way, and it's reportable." Pierce's new ethics policy made us all walk on eggshells. The other laughed under his breath. "Yeah, maybe we should have dragged him out again. Just not on camera this time." Malcolm stopped mid-step. For a brief second, anger rose hot in his chest, but he let it pass. He turned the corner silently, saying nothing. He'd learned long ago that hatred feeds on attention. Inside the main training room, Lisa stood in front of a group of new hires, her voice steady but strained. "You are the new face of Aurora," she said. "Every interaction matters. Passengers don't remember the seat they sat in. They remember how they were treated." When the session ended, she walked over to Malcolm. "They're listening," she said quietly, "but not all of them believe." He nodded. Belief takes longer than policy. That afternoon, Robert Glenn called a private meeting with Malcolm and Samantha Chen, the ethics officer. The tension in the room was palpable. Glenn looked weary, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. "We've had several anonymous complaints," he began, "about internal resistance, rumors, leaked memos, even threats. Someone inside doesn't want these reforms to last." Samantha folded her arms. "That was inevitable. The old culture isn't gone. It's just waiting." Glenn turned to Malcolm. "You're the public face of this new Aurora. If this explodes again, they'll blame you." Malcolm's voice was calm. "Then let them. Change has always had a cost. I'm willing to pay mine." Later that week, during a late-night inspection at the training facility, Malcolm discovered something unsettling. In one of the simulator rooms, a graffiti message had been scrawled in red marker across the glass. "You ruined us. Go back where you came from." The words were crude, but what struck him wasn't the insult. It was the handwriting. He recognized it. It belonged to Rick Halverson, the very man who had dragged him from his seat months ago. Malcolm frowned. "Impossible," he whispered to himself. Rick had been terminated, his license revoked, his name publicly disgraced, or so everyone thought. The next morning, he confronted Glenn. "Rick's name is still active in your internal roster system." Why Glenn froze. "That's not possible." "Check again," Malcolm said. Within minutes, Glenn's assistant confirmed it. Rick Halverson had been rehired under a subsidiary contractor for ground logistics just 2 weeks prior. "He's not supposed to have passenger contact," the assistant stammered. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "That's how prejudice survives. It changes uniforms, but it never leaves the building." Glenn's face turned pale. I'll terminate him again immediately. Don't, Malcolm said sharply. Not yet. Glenn looked confused. Why not? Because firing him twice won't fix anything. We need to see how deep this rot goes. If he's back, he didn't get here alone. Samantha nodded in agreement. He's right. We trace this. We might uncover everyone helping him. For the next 3 days, Malcolm and Samantha quietly investigated. They combed through digital records, anonymous messages, internal emails. What they found was worse than expected. A small but organized group of mid-level employees had been exchanging private messages mocking the reforms. They called themselves the Originals. Their messages dripped with sarcasm and venom. Let Pierce run the show. One wrote, He'll crash it himself soon enough. Samantha read the threat aloud, her jaw tightening. This isn't just defiance, it's sabotage. Malcolm's eyes were steady. Then we deal with it, not by punishment, by exposure. That evening, he called a company-wide meeting. Employees filled the auditorium, murmuring, unsure of what was coming. The air felt heavy, charged. Malcolm walked on stage, wearing no suit jacket, no podium between him and them, just a microphone and truth. I've been told some of you think Aurora's changed too much. He began, his tone calm but firm. That we've lost what made us efficient. That fairness slows us down. Maybe you even believe I don't belong here. The room went still. He continued, You're right about one thing, Aurora isn't the same. It never will be. Because the world you miss, the one where silence protected the powerful, that world collapsed the moment we chose integrity. He let the silence stretch. Let the words settle. If you think I'm your enemy, you've mistaken my purpose. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to make sure no one else goes through what I did. Then he paused and turned toward the projection screen behind him. But if you believe this company should keep its old ways, maybe you should see what those ways look like in the light. The screen flickered on an enlarged screenshot of the Originals group chat. The room gasped. Names, messages, and timestamps appeared clearly. Some people buried their faces in their hands. Others stared in disbelief. I'm not showing this to humiliate anyone, Malcolm said quietly. I'm showing it because truth doesn't heal in the dark. He stepped away from the podium, voice softening. You have a choice. Keep clinging to a past that burned this company to the ground, or help rebuild something worth flying for. I can't make that choice for you. When he left the stage, no one clapped, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was reflective. Sometimes, real change begins not with applause, but with discomfort. After the meeting, Glenn caught up to him in the hallway. That was risky, he said. You could have created a bigger scandal. Malcolm shook his head. Scandals destroy companies. Honesty saves them. The next morning, an email arrived in Malcolm's inbox. It was from Rick. You think you can fix what's broken, but you're naive. You didn't shut down a system. You just paused it. And people like me, we wait. Malcolm stared at the screen for a long time, then replied simply, Then keep waiting. We're done flying on fear. Weeks later, something remarkable happened. Anonymous letters began arriving at his office, employees admitting they had once looked the other way, now pledging to do better. Some were short, some deeply personal. One simply said, You made me see my silence. When Malcolm read that one, he smiled faintly. That single sentence meant more than all the public praise in the world, because he knew now real resistance wasn't in the loudest critics. It lived in the quiet hearts that decided to change. That evening, Ellen called him. You turned a rebellion into reflection. she said. "That's harder than shutting down an airline." He chuckled softly. "We're not done yet. Change has turbulence." She smiled through the phone. "Then I hope you've fastened your seatbelt." It was a Wednesday morning when the storm rolled in thick, bruised clouds stretching over the city like a warning. From his office window on the 12th floor, Dr. Malcolm Pierce watched the runway lights flicker against the incoming rain. Flights were delayed, passengers restless, and inside Aurora Air's control tower, tension brewed like thunder before a strike. Downstairs, in the operations hub, Lisa was briefing her crew. "Weather advisories are shifting fast," she said, tapping on the digital map. "All flights westbound will be rerouted over the Rockies. Safety protocols must be followed, no exceptions." Malcolm joined them moments later. Umbrella-dripping rainwater. "Has Flight 238 cleared inspection?" he asked. Lisa nodded. "It's scheduled to depart for Denver in 20 minutes. Captain Reyes is in command." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Good. She's solid, level-headed." But Samantha Chen appeared in the doorway, her tablet glowing with data. "We've got a problem," she said. Flight 238's ground crew included a last-minute addition contractor ID or RH91 tour. Malcolm froze. RH. He already knew who that was. "Rick Halverson," Samantha confirmed quietly. "He's back on shift today. Authorization came through one of the internal contractors." The room fell silent. The name felt like a curse. After being exposed publicly, Rick had vanished for months. For him to reappear now, right before a major weather front, it didn't feel like coincidence. "Get him pulled off immediately," Malcolm ordered. But before they could act, the intercom crackled. "Flight 238 has just departed." Gate 12, a controller's voice said, "Wheels up in 3 minutes." Malcolm's pulse quickened. He's already in the field. Rain battered the windows. The tower went gray. Lisa turned to him, eyes wide. "You think he'd try something?" Malcolm didn't answer right away. His gut twisted. Rick was bitter, unstable, humiliated. Someone like that didn't just fade quietly. Minutes later, as Flight 238 ascended into storm clouds, reports started coming in. Electrical interference, cabin systems flickering, a possible mechanical override alert flashing from the left engine console. Inside the plane, passengers stirred in confusion as oxygen masks briefly dropped and retracted. Captain Reyes's calm voice filled the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing a temporary systems glitch. Everything is under control." In the control room, Malcolm leaned over the console beside Robert Glenn. "Can we contact the cockpit? Negative," the technician said. "Comms are unstable static interference." Samantha's fingers danced over her screen. "That's not weather. Someone triggered an unauthorized software patch in the maintenance log just before takeoff." Malcolm's heart sank. "Rick." Glenn's voice trembled. "He sabotaged it." Malcolm's tone hardened. "Not the plane itself, just enough to send a message. He wants chaos, not casualties. But that doesn't mean it's safe. Get FAA emergency clearance." Glenn barked, "Bring her back." But as controllers began redirecting Flight 238, thunder exploded across the field. A bolt of lightning struck near the perimeter fence, knocking out partial radar. "Backup systems engaged," Samantha said. "We're not blind yet." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. "Patch me through to Captain Reyes." Static filled the speakers. Then her voice cut through, tight but composed. "Aurora Tower. This is 238. We've got partial engine readouts down. Stabilizers holding. Requesting vector for emergency return." "Copy that," Malcolm said. "You're clear for priority landing. Maintain altitude until further instruction." She hesitated. Who am I speaking to, Malcolm Pierce? Her exhale was audible, even through the static. Good. If I don't make it back, tell my son. You'll tell him yourself, he said, calm but fierce. Just focus on the instruments. Rain lashed the windows. The storm raged harder. Meanwhile, Lisa received word from security Rick's access badge had just been scanned near the maintenance hangar. He's still here, she whispered. He's watching. Malcolm's jaw clenched. Keep him there. No confrontation until I say so. He returned his focus to the monitors. Flight 238. This is Aurora Tower. Adjust heading to 180. You've got a clean corridor for descent. Then came a chilling sound, the cockpit alarm blaring through the speakers. Engine 2 offline, Reyes shouted. We're losing thrust, controllers shouted over one another. Glenn's face drained of color. If they can't stabilize, they'll have to ditch. But Malcolm leaned forward, voice steady as steel. Captain, you still have manual override. Bypass digital autopilot. Switch to analog control. You trained for this. There was a long pause. Then Reyes's voice returned stronger now. Copy that. Analog engaged. For 10 eternal minutes. Everyone in the tower watched the blip on the radar slowly circle back toward the runway. The plane descended through the storm, tilting dangerously, lightning flashing across its wings like veins of fire. Then, silence. No response. Malcolm's knuckles whitened as he gripped the console. Come on, Reyes. Seconds stretched into lifetimes. Finally, the radio crackled soft. Shaky laughter broke through. Aurora Tower. This is Flight 238. We're on the ground. Cheers erupted through the control room. Technicians clapped, some crying openly. Glenn sank into his chair, whispering, Thank God. But Malcolm didn't cheer. His eyes were already scanning the side feed from the hangar cameras. Rick Halverson stood in the shadows, watching the chaos unfold on a monitor, smirking. Malcolm turned to Lisa. Seal the hangar. Now. Security teams moved in within minutes. Rick tried to run but was cornered near the supply gate. Even then, he was defiant, shouting as they cuffed him. You think this ends with me? You think you can wash away what this company is? You're just painting over rot. Malcolm walked up slowly, rain dripping from his coat. You're right, he said quietly. Rot doesn't disappear overnight, but we don't stop cleaning because it's hard. Rick glared at him, soaked and furious. You ruined everything. No, Malcolm replied. The truth did. I just stopped pretending not to see it. As they led Rick away, Glenn approached Malcolm, voice trembling. He could have killed hundreds. Malcolm shook his head. He could have, but he didn't want to. He wanted fear. Fear spreads faster than fire. Later that evening, when the storm finally cleared, Malcolm stood alone on the tarmac. The rain had stopped, but puddles shimmered under the runway lights like fragments of broken glass. He could hear the distant hum of repair crews, the low murmur of relief mixed with exhaustion. Ellen Moore appeared beside him, holding her recorder. You saved that flight, she said softly. He looked out at the runway, his reflection wavering in the wet asphalt. No, Captain Reyes did. The crew did. Change isn't about one person being right. It's about enough people choosing to stay calm when everything tells them to panic. She lowered her voice. And Rick. He'll face justice, Malcolm said. But what matters more is what we learned from him. He wasn't born hateful. The system fed that into him. Now it's on us to unlearn it. Ellen nodded slowly. You know, that's not the quote people expect from a man who just stopped to sabotage mid-flight. Malcolm smiled faintly. Maybe that's the problem. We expect anger when what we need is clarity. That night, the FAA officially grounded all flights for inspection. News headlines blazed. Sabotage attempt. Foiled at Aurora, Air Leader of Reform holds company together. But Malcolm didn't read them. He sat in his quiet office, replaying the radio crackle of Captain Reyes's voice, hearing the unspoken fear and courage in it. He whispered to himself, almost as prayer, justice isn't a one-time act. It's daily maintenance. Outside, dawn began to break, streaking the horizon with fragile light. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the moment just before takeoff. The sun rose pale and quiet the next morning, spreading thin ribbons of light over Aurora's hangars. For the first time in months, there were no flashing headlines, no crisis briefings, no alarms piercing the calm. Only the distant hum of engines and the smell of rain-soaked tarmac. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning. In the boardroom, Malcolm Pierce stood by the window, watching a plane ascend through the clouds. Robert Glenn sat at the long mahogany table, papers spread before him, legal documents, FIA reports, and an internal investigation summary. Across from them sat Captain Reyes, still pale but composed, the faint tremor in her hands betraying what she'd endured. "They're calling you a hero," Glenn said softly. Reyes shook her head. "Heroes don't panic mid-air," she murmured. "I did. For a second. I thought it was over." Malcolm turned from the window. "You didn't panic. You remembered your training. You trusted your instincts." Reyes looked up, eyes moist. "You trusted me first. That's what made me steady again." Samantha Chen entered with a tablet in her hands. FAA's final report just came through. They confirmed it. Rick Halverson acted alone, but the system failures that allowed his access were rooted in outdated contractor protocols. She exhaled sharply. "That means accountability doesn't end with him." Glenn nodded grimly. "It ends with me." Malcolm studied him for a long moment. "You don't need to take the fall for a culture you inherited, Robert. You just need to make sure it never takes root again." Glenn smiled faintly. "That's the kind of line reporters love." At that moment, the door opened. Ellen Moore walked in, her camera crew behind her. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the world wants to hear what comes next." The room stiffened. Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're relentless?" "That's my job," she said with a half smile. "People are watching this story not because of what went wrong, but because of what might go right. They need to see what accountability looks like when it's real." Glenn nodded toward Malcolm. "Then he's your man. He's the one who made this possible." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Don't hand me your redemption." But Ellen only smiled. "Maybe it's not about redemption. Maybe it's about recognition." That afternoon, they held a press conference in the same hangar where Rick had been arrested. The echoes of footsteps, the scent of jet fuel. It was all still there, but the energy had changed. Workers lined the walls, some with arms crossed, some curious, others just quietly listening. Ellen set up the mic, cameras flashing as Malcolm stepped forward. He didn't have a script, just a simple note card with a few words scribbled in his neat handwriting. Truth, responsibility, repair. He took a breath, then began. "Months ago, I was dragged off a plane because someone decided I didn't belong in a seat I paid for. That moment wasn't about one airline or one bad employee. It was about a sickness that runs deeper than any company policy. It's a sickness that tells us dignity is earned through appearance, not humanity." The crowd was silent. The echo of his voice filled the space. He continued, softer now. When I came back to Aurora, I didn't come to seek revenge. I came because I believed this place could change, because the same sky that covered me in humiliation could also cover us in redemption. He paused, eyes scanning the workers before him. Rick Halverson made choices that endangered lives. He'll face justice. But if we only punish individuals and ignore the systems that shape them, we'll learn nothing. This company will no longer chase image over integrity. Our measure will be how we treat the smallest voice in the cabin, not the loudest passenger in first class. There was a long silence. Then, slow and hesitant, applause began from the back Lisa, standing tall, clapping once, then twice, until the room joined her. It wasn't thunderous. It was steady, earnest. After the conference, reporters swarmed. Questions flew. Microphones hovered. But Malcolm only answered a few before slipping away to the edge of the hangar, where he could watch planes take off again. He didn't need headlines. He needed peace. Ellen found him there, recording device still in hand. "That line," she said quietly, "about the sky. It'll live longer than any policy." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe people just need to be reminded that the sky remembers everything we do beneath it." She tilted her head. "Do you ever get tired of carrying this kind of weight?" He thought for a moment. "Every day. But then I think of people who can't afford to stop fighting. Kids watching from their screens, wondering if the world will ever see them as enough. I can't quit before they believe it will." As the afternoon light shifted into gold, Glenn joined them. "There's one last thing you should know," he said. "The board voted this morning. They want you to take on a new role. Chief Ethics and Operations Officer, independent authority. You'll report directly to federal oversight and the board." Malcolm blinked, surprised. "That's a lot of trust." "It's earned," Glenn said simply. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "We can't erase the past, but we can build a company worthy of the people who believed in better." Malcolm took his hand. "Then let's make sure the sky doesn't have to remember us for the wrong reasons again." Months passed. Aurora Air slowly rebuilt its reputation not through slogans, but through quiet consistency. Complaints dropped, satisfaction rose, and more importantly, the fear that had once haunted its employees began to fade. One evening, long after the offices had emptied, Malcolm walked through the nearly silent terminal. He stopped by a gate window and looked out at a departing flight. A young black father was helping his daughter fasten her seatbelt, smiling gently as she giggled. The scene struck him so ordinary, yet once impossible. He smiled. That's what justice looked like now. Not press releases or protests, but small, unremarkable acts of peace. Ellen's voice came from behind him. "I'm working on the documentary's final line," she said. "I want it to end with your words, but I can't decide which ones." He turned to her. "Use this," he said softly. "The sky remembers what we do, but it also forgives what we choose to change." She smiled, eyes glistening. Perfect. As she left, Malcolm stayed a moment longer. The runway lights shimmered, guiding each plane into the dark horizon. Somewhere in that endless stretch of night, he imagined the thousands of lives now moving safely through the air, people unaware of the war once fought so they could simply fly without fear. He breathed deeply, feeling the calm settle inside him like a quiet victory. Change hadn't come fast, and it hadn't come easy, but it had come, and that was enough. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly again, not threatening, just reminding. The sky never forgets, but it always gives another chance. The story of Dr. Malcolm Pierce teaches us that dignity is not something others can give or take. It's something we choose to protect, even in silence. When injustice tries to humiliate us, our response defines the kind of world we build for those who come after. Malcolm didn't use anger to win. He used clarity, truth, and compassion, and that is what changed everything. For older generations who have seen both progress and pain, this story is a reminder that justice often moves slowly, but it does move. Systems can be rebuilt, hearts can be re-educated, and wounds can heal when courage meets grace. In our daily lives, we all face moments big or small where we can either look away or speak up. The lesson is simple, yet powerful. Integrity is quiet strength. Whether on a plane, in a meeting, or within a family, we have the power to stand with dignity, not for pride, but for peace. Thank you for watching and feeling this story with us. Every view, every comment, every share helps more people see that empathy and respect still matter in today's world. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's keep telling stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all that dignity always deserves a seat, no matter where we are.